Welcome to the Pull the Chute podcast with Jeff and Jana. This is our weekly venture into the world of small to medium-sized businesses and the entrepreneurial spirit that drives success.
So our goal here is to help you grow and to be the best you can be, both in business and personally. To do that, we identify and we discuss topics that will hopefully help you as you work to build a successful business.
We also interview business owners and executives. It's our hope that you may be able to gain insight on ways to help you be a better leader and provide a better culture for your people.
Our mission here is to help you pull the chute once a week to work on your business instead of always working in your business.
So we hope you find these discussions insightful, helpful, and useful.
And thanks for your support. We hope you enjoy today's podcast.
Welcome everyone to the Pull the Chute podcast with Jeff and Jana. Good morning. I hope you're all doing very well. Jana, how are things in Nashville these days?
They are quite lovely. Well, they're overcast lovely.
Oh, you're overcast.
Not springtime sunny lovely yet, but we're getting.
Yeah, we're nice. We're nice and sunny here in Chicago, so we're loving that. And the weather is definitely warming up. As most of our listeners know, we record these on Thursdays and Fridays, so it might be April when you're recording this, but it might be June when you're hearing it, I think. So that's kind of how that goes. So, hey, Jana, we have an international guest today, so I'm excited about that. We have Liam O'Neill with us today from London, or from England, I should say. I'm not sure if it's London, but Liam, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me, Jeff. Yeah, absolute pleasure to be here. And yeah, you're absolutely on the money. It is London.
It is London.
It is London. Great. I love it.
I didn't ask that beforehand, but yeah. Well, you got the great accent. I love it so much. Hey, Liam, what we like to do with our guests is have them tell us, our listeners, a little bit about themselves, because you do it much better than we ever would. So just a favor, give us a brief background about who you are and how you got to where you're at today. And then we're just going to have this great conversation. We're looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Liam. I run a management consultancy in the UK and serve in most of mainland Europe. It's called BPMD. We're a little boutique firm. We help companies to set up process management disciplines, internal teams who look after processes, analyze them, improve them, manage them, and basically stay on top of the way in which the business operates. Work out of a London office, but work across all of Europe, very occasionally in the US as well, and even in some far-flung places like Johannesburg. Me personally, I've been in London for about 10 years now. I have a couple of young kids running around who do their best to invade every business meeting I try to take from home. And I try my best to keep them out, but they're very slippy sometimes.
That's great.
That kind of happened with the pandemic, didn't it, though, yeah. Liam? Like everybody was home, and then all the commercials you see, little kids running around and photo bombing, a lot of those. That sounds great. So when you say business processes and management, do you specifically concentrate on the leadership, or do you go in and kind of work from the top down? Do you work with middle management? How do you guys do it, Liam, when you say it's more boutique-y? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, so what we want to do is make sure every organization we work with, every organization we partner with, we want them to have a long-term sustainable process team that stays in the business and helps them to control and optimize what they do. To make that work, though, you have to get sponsorship top down. So a lot of what we do is working with the executive initially to build that business case, to build that buy-in at the top level, and then cascading back down through the organization, making sure the boots on the ground know what it is and have the skills to do it properly.
Mm-hmm.
And so as you do that, I'm sorry, Jana, real quick, as you're going through that process, process and change don't always go together well, right? So if you're coming in and offering them some new ideas, new ways to make sure that they stay long-term, how are you handling the change and the pushback that change creates?
Yeah, so this is something that we really battled with early on as a company. So what we initially did was we'd go into companies and set up these process teams. We'd look at the data and look at what was happening, find all these great innovative ways to change things up. And then that's amazing. You've got a portfolio of things you need to go and deliver. But what happens next?
Yes.
There's this handoff from the process team to the teams who actually have to make the change happen, to the teams who are actually in the business and have to do this on the ground. And things slow down. It is quite hard. There's always going to be competing priorities for people. People are going to be pushed to do the business, do the day job, and have the improvement project sitting on top of that we need to put time into as well. So actually making a change happen is something we've really shifted our focus onto in the last few years. Not just designing something that looks nice, a process that you aspirationally want to get to, but then how do you carry that through? And there's a few different tools and techniques we use. Maybe we can dive into a couple of them, from kind of bridging that gap between the designers and then the actual delivery team. And then at the back end, the tools you use for actually getting people to understand what it is that they need to change. Good process models, digital adoption tools, some really interesting chatbots can be a really good way of educating people on that new way of working. And that's really been kind of the evolution of BPM, and definitely our focus at BPMD in taking it from just a nice thing to have to something that actually covers that entire journey and takes it from an idea to actually getting something into action.
So Liam, how long does the process team or the facilitation team generally on average work with the company before they then hand it off?
Yeah, it does vary. It does vary. What you tend to find is some sectors, some teams, some organizations pick these things up really quickly. They have the teams and the capabilities in-house to really work with new ways of working, pick it up and take it forward really quickly. We did some work with Trainline. I don't know if you'll have heard of them in the US. In the UK, they are massive. If you're buying a train ticket, you're buying it through Trainline. It's a really cool tech company. They don't
Yes.
actually run trains. They don't do any kind of old-worldy things like that. It's just an app. But the team there, because it's a tech organization, because they're very new, innovative, forward thinking, they're superb. With those guys, we worked with them for just a handful of months, really. We did some implementation, some training, some coaching, and then the internal team were absolute superstars. They picked it up and carried it forward right away. Whereas there's some legacy companies, some legacy industries where it just needs a little bit more hand-holding. Some of the things that you need to do to make change happen, delegation of authority into the business, working with people not on really strict timelines, but being reactive around resource availability, sometimes going live with something that's good but not perfect. That can be a little bit of a difficult pill to swallow for some of these legacy industries that have this embedded way of working. So, with those companies, you might need to work a little bit longer just to get them on board.
So do us a favor, just for our listeners, describe when you're talking about process, modeling and change, and give us an example of something that you've done, just so that people understand what you're actually talking about.
Yeah, of course. Of course. So, really good one was we were working with an organization who manages these big offshore drills that operate in the sea, and they're looking for oil, and they're digging out a bit of that black gold from the bottom of the deep, deep oceans. And it's a really interesting company. They have a lot of these heavy assets across the world in lots of difficult to reach places. And looking at the procure to pay process, they recognized there were some issues. There's some issues with how invoices were being paid, and there were some issues with how they were managing the inventory they had on hand. They knew they could do it a little bit better. They had some broad ideas, but they weren't quite clear on how to deliver that. So what we did with that company was we worked with them. We, with the executives, drew out what the strategy was, what is it they needed to shift and change to really evolve the business. And then working with some key business stakeholders, we drew out what they would do and what the day-to-day process was across procure to pay. We had a little bit of data sitting behind that so we can see what sites were doing well, which ones could do a little bit better. And using that, we ran a few workshops and said, okay, if we're going to evolve this process, what do we need to tweak here? What do we need to change here? How can we reduce the cost of inventory we have on hand? How can we be more efficient instead of having millions of pounds of equipment, millions of dollars of equipment sitting beside the shore, waiting to be taken out to rig? How can we slim that down and focus on what they really need there on hand? How can we reduce that inventory on hand cost? And then when it comes to the invoices, what can we do to make that payment a little bit easier? So they're getting some of those discounts from suppliers. So they're not having all these disputes and they don't need all these spare hands trying to manually match invoices. So across of it, there's a lot of different challenges. And I'll just pick up on the invoice one because that's a really interesting one. They have this massive backlog of invoices and they're all trying to match them to the POs, to the GRs, and it was failing. The automatic matching just wasn't working. The system was just absolutely not playing ball. And we had this growing backlog. We had temporary workers coming in trying to manage the backlog. And the initial question was, can we automate this? Can we get an RPA bot in? This is a couple of years ago to do this automatic matching. And if you look at that problem in a silo, if you don't think about the broader process, it sounds like a good idea. Let's get a little robot in that'll automate the matching, that'll sort out the backlog. But you have to look at the broader process. Why are so many of these failing? Why is it broken at this back end? And you draw over a broader process. And it's not that the finance team aren't working efficiently, and it's not that the system wasn't working for them. It was upstream procurement was cutting corners because they didn't know they had to fill in certain fields. They had to keep certain bits of the data nice and clean so that it fed through downstream into finance, helped this automatic matching, prevented this massive pileup. So you create that visibility of the process, you understand the issue and see where that root cause is. And then once you've got that project, you actually have to take it through into delivery. Go and work with the procurement teams, do the training packages, put in place the data, validation cycles on the tool, on the base on the platforms that they're using, and try to roll out that new way of working. Ultimately, it makes the company work just that little bit better.
That's so interesting because you're actually touching a lot of aspects of the business, Liam, like you talked about, the people that initiate the invoices and then the people that review them, then the procurement and that, yeah, so it is an entire chain of process that you're actually touching or having to manage and re-instruct or tweak. So that's interesting.
Yeah. So I have a question. We live in this new world of AI,
Yes, that's what I was going to say.
right? So how does, well, two questions. One is, can you leverage AI to make your job easier? But do you have to be cautious that it doesn't replace you? I think
Yes. That's everybody's
Yeah.
question right now, Jeff.
It's I think one of the most interesting things is the different ways you're seeing it being applied. You see some of the big houses like your SAPs of the world coming up with these grand plans for what it can do and launching these AI roadmaps where it's going to be supporting the way they use the core tools, evolving that. And that's great. These big institutional changes that are going to have sweeping impacts once they're mature. But with your SAPs of the world, they're going to be a little bit slower to adapt to that to solve some of those problems just because they have to have a more comprehensive solution. They can't go live with a half-baked idea. And you're seeing a lot of these smaller third-party new organizations emerging that are using AI in really cool ways. Even looking at what we do in consulting, looking internally, there's some really interesting AI agents out there that do some things like proposal writing. And I've looked at some of these demos, and I used to spend days writing proposals, RFPs, RFQs. You look at what some of these AI agents can do, and it's 10 times better than I could do in it could give me 5 days and I wouldn't come close to what they're doing in a matter of seconds.
Yeah.
There's always a risk. There's hallucinations, there's missteps. There's that risk of this inaccuracy creeping in. But if you use it, if you understand what your core process is, what you should try and do as a business, and instead of just trying to throw that out the window and say, how do we throw in AI to completely replace that? If instead you understand what you're doing, the objectives are, and you supplement that process with AI, and you understand the risks and the impact it can have, and redesign the way you work around it, rather than just try to replace out of the box, I think it has a really transformative impact.
So, Liam, what obstacles are you finding with the generational issues in the workplace? We talk about that a lot, Jeff and I, in understanding that the four very distinct generations are now in the workplace and they all communicate differently and they process differently and they require different, just all kinds of different things, different communication, different explanation. What do you find?
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. A lot of my organization I'm a millennial, and our founder was, I don't even know what 60-ish
Baby
years
boomer.
old.
He was a baby boomer.
Boomer.
Yeah.
He was a baby boomer, and the way of working with communication was massively different. There's this idea of I think increasingly prevalent in some of these organizations who are really embracing the younger generations is self-management and bringing more of those concepts in. And we're playing about with that internally at BPMD, trying to find an interesting way to make it work. But when you take that to clients and take that to these bigger organizations, companies like Philips and Sony and Trainline and these other ones, sometimes you are battling some of those institutional ways of working. less so train line and some of the tech companies, but some of those larger legacy industry ones. One of the big things I think is I touched on it before, and it ties across generations, but also ties into workplace culture, is delegation of authority into the business. Whether you call it self-management or whether you can call it controlled delegation, I think effective business operation, you need to delegate that authority from the head of function, from the very senior level into the business, so that people can be responsible for the way they work, they can be responsible for how the process is done, and you don't end up with these bottlenecks at the top levels of command. Because otherwise change doesn't happen. The head of finance can only have so many things on his plate at once. You've got to broaden the number of plates you have on the table and spread it between as many people as possible who you can delegate that trust into.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it is very true that the younger generations do like to sort of self-manage. They don't want to be handheld, or they don't want to have, Big Brother overlooking every single thing they're doing. So there's definitely that need to communicate that, though, from the get-go, right? From senior management, that they're willing not to do that as long as you do your work. And this is a little bit of what sometimes we run into when we're talking to some of these coaches, where they say, well, then they've got to do the work. And that's sometimes where the disconnect is. The senior management has to set up those expectations so that then middle management can watch over it or oversee it. And then again, the boots on the ground understands that process within the company. It is interesting.
100%.
Hey,
100%.
so question.
I think there's a big difference, a big nuance between micromanagement and accountability. And
Yeah.
sometimes people don't understand that. Micromanagement, people sitting on your shoulder and seeing what you're doing and controlling the way you do it, that's something of a past that really impedes efficiency. That's not effective. But you absolutely have to hold people accountable. If people aren't delivering, if the results aren't there, if the impact they're delivering for the business isn't what it needs to be, or even if they're doing it in a more qualitative way, if the culture they're bringing to the table isn't great, people absolutely have to be held accountable. Self-manage, but you still need to manage them.
Yeah.
Let me ask that on that particular topic then. So one of the things that I believe in, and I just was curious because again, you're overseas and things are a little different, but I'm always about when you're trying to hold people accountable, it's important to let them understand and make sure that you tell them why they're doing what they're doing, and because we call it the why and because. Do you guys use that methodology over in England and internationally as well?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. So, I mean, inward looking in our organization, we work really hard to make sure everyone's in line with what our plan is for the 5 years, how we're going to take that forward, what offerings we're prioritizing, why we do what we do. We really want complete transparency over as much of a business as we can. There's some things obviously you can't share, like some of the governance elements. We want people to understand the direction business is taking and the role their work is playing in that.
Yeah.
When we take it to client sites, I really love the concept of process ownership. So I think a lot of companies get it wrong, and they have really high level process owners. Like, I'm a process owner for order to cash, and it's really vague. Order to cash is massive. Having one process owner for that is like having one player on a football team. They can be the best player in the world. They're not going to win. You need a lot of different people working together, pulling in the same direction. So when we do process ownership, what you want is someone close to the business, someone knows how that process is done, and you can hold them accountable for how that process is performing. So instead of it being for order to cash, you break it down a couple of levels. Instead of it being order to cash, it's maybe accounts receivable. Maybe it's even as granular as someone who manages the process of inbound invoices. And at that level, you have someone who's actually got a day job. That's not a full-time job process owner. They can be responsible for how that organization manages inbound invoices. There can be really clear metrics for how that process works. What's your automation rate? How much overtime are you using? How many queries, disputes are you having? You can get really specific with what success looks like. And then you can delegate the power to that person to be able to control it, change it. But ultimately, you want them to be able to understand that their work, their role, the impact they're having is making this process work, is playing the role in the wider picture, is helping drive the business success.
Yeah, I love that. Love that. Because I mean, it's really important for people to feel that they're part of, especially when you're talking about change, right? We're talking about how difficult change, for them to feel part of that process is important. But I think clearly for them to understand why we're doing the change, because this is what we're trying to get to, is really key. Is really key. Hey, one other quick question before we kind of have to wrap up here, but what's 2 or 3 things that you guys are really struggle with in most cases when you're in there, you're trying to identify new processes and make changes? What give me a couple of things that you really struggle with so that our listeners have an understanding of what they should be watching for as well.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest pitfalls is people aren't ambitious enough with the change initiatives.
Mm.
I think you need to aim really high. If you're just trying to fix one little problem in one little box, that can be really great. That can be fantastic, and you can have really transformative results doing continuous improvement on micro scale. But as soon as you start to look to launch programs and functions, aim really high. Look at your entire way your business runs its outbound sales engine. Look across all of it. Look across the functions. Don't just live in a single function. Don't just live in supply chain. Think about across the entire span of it. And don't just try and do the easy bit. Don't just do the data setup, do the whole piece. So one of the big challenges, people aiming a bit too focused, a bit too narrow, without the ambition to really carry that through to the results piece. I think one of the other like real challenges we tend to have is when you have misalignment between different sponsors. And this happens way too often. So with CIOs and sometimes CFOs, you can have these really cool ideas on innovation and ambition and putting time into doing something in a really inventive way using the latest and greatest technologies. But then you have your COOs and CPOs who they know the way the business works. I had a really senior sales director once I was working with, and we were doing some sales transformation on his process. And the core engine, they were trying to digitize it, push more to self-serve. And I was talking to him about how he does his sales, how his team works. And he was a big Danish guy. And he said, I asked him what tools does he use, what systems does he use. And he said, oh, we just talk. I was like, oh, okay. So how do you record the details? How do you agree them? And he just leant into his pocket, pulled out a napkin, and then said, we just write them on these in the pub. And
That's funny.
That's funny. Sometimes
if
your
it
best
works for him,
ideas
great.
are happen in the pub.
I gotta tell you, I've actually over the years, I've actually developed a couple of systems based on an idea drawn on a napkin.
Uh-huh.
I used to have a business partner that used to literally go, "Can you do this?" And he'd hold up the napkin with a drawing on it, and I'd look at it and go, "Yeah, I actually think I can."
That's
Um,
funny.
If it works,
Hey, Liam, thanks so
it
much for
works.
being on the show today. We really appreciate it. Processing, and just looking at your business and understanding that things sometimes do need to change and that you got to kind of look at a process and see what you can do them better. So important. So we're glad that you and over at BPMD can bring that to different companies and to different areas because it's really important to do. So if people want to get a hold of you, Liam, how can they do that?
So best place to reach me is on LinkedIn.
Okay. Great.
That's
So look up Liam O'Neill and kind of connect with him. So again, Liam, thanks for being on the show. We appreciate it. So interesting, so fun. To all the listeners out there, Jan and I are always interested in hearing from you, as you know. So reach out to us, Jana at janalandry.com or Jeff at pullthechute.net. We're here for you. If you need to talk through some situations, if you need just a little bit of advice, reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you. Until the next time, folks, stay safe and be healthy.